Chapter 18 Coronation. Urza had to give Kovacs credit. The man was a remorseless killer, but he did have a certain amount of cold-blooded style. Urza was feeling generous as he waited to die. He was embedded up to his neck in a cube of flowstone, 8 feet wide. At the rear of the cube, a thin pipe stretched back to one of the main flowstone conduits. Little by little, the cube was growing larger, and therein lay Kovacs' wicked genius. The cube was balanced atop the flowstone furnace. An endless blue torrent of energy plunged into the crucible, meeting the raw lava rock brought up from below the citadel. When Kovacs and his minions placed him here, Urza had been at least 12 inches from the edge of the furnace cone. In the past 4 hours, the cube had grown at least 8 inches per side. In another 6 or 7 hours, the cube would be so large the narrow ledge could not support it. He would topple forward into the works and be disintegrated by the furious energy beam. It took Kovacs only minutes to create the cube. He mentally programmed the nanomachines to retain their shape as the cube grew, and thoughtfully provided Urza with a cavity in the cube sized exactly to his body. Once the sergeants shifted the cube in place atop the crucible, Kovacs stood back and watched for several minutes. The flowstone also absorbed radiant heat from the energy beam and got hotter all the time. "Isn't this all a bit too elaborate?" Urza said.
Would you tell an artist his painting was too elaborate?
Replied Kovacs.
If need be. You have no sensitivity, boy. The beauty of this arrangement is its slowness. You have half a day to contemplate your end. I hope you use it wisely.
Why kill me at all? I'm no threat to you. I can't even get out of this cube, much less challenge your command of Rath.
You really do miss the point. You've been an annoyance to me, and therefore deserve to die. Also, because of your close ties to the emissary, killing you should be very painful for her.
Urza called Kovacs all the dirty names he had in his considerable vocabulary. Kovacs responded by tightening the flowstone around Urza's throat until his tongue protruded and his face turned blue. Then, just as suddenly, he'd relented.
I'd love to stay and play, but I'm being crowned today,
he said.
Duty before pleasure, as they say.
He descended the steps to where his private guard was waiting and never looked back. Urza tried to influence the flowstone enough to allow him to escape. He expanded the space around his body slightly at the expense of enlarging the cube prematurely. It was like wrestling inside a block of cheese. When he concentrated, the stone closest to him softened, but he couldn't influence the outer bulk of the cube. The effort left him gasping. Growing heat wrung sweat from his every pore. What a fool he was to agree to this sham. He was a wizard, not a politician or a warlord. All his grandiose plans to escape or become Evancar of Rath were the consequences of overweening pride. Now he's paying the price for his folly. His eyes started to swell shut. He guessed this was from being so close to the blazing energy beam. Such promise, such talent he had, all wasted on this ugly, colorless world, ruled by ugly, colorless people. Was this the ultimate fate of Dominaria? Should the Phyrexian invasion succeed? If so, he was glad he'd not be alive to see it. There was Belby. Why did he care about her? He tried to tell himself he'd seduced her, that his motives were only self-serving. Looking back on it, those hours he had spent with her were not just the best ones he had on Rath, but maybe the best he'd known in his entire short life. He didn't seduce her. He was the one seduced. For the first time, Urza found a woman who didn't ignore him or reject him for his thundering arrogance. The hole at his neck was just large enough for Urza to poke a few fingers out of. Despite his best efforts, he found he couldn't enlarge the hole. Conjuration was always more sure when the sorcerer could use his hands to gesture, but in this situation he'd have to do without. Once before, he'd searched for Belby with a magical ferret. Now he summoned a similar creation, this time a retriever. It was hard evoking anything to appear in the glare of the energy beam, but he managed to create his retriever in the air above his head. It resembled a ghostly ball studded with spikes, like a translucent sea urchin. "Bring Belby here," was all he told it. The retriever spun away. Urza couldn't tell if it survived passing so close to the beam, but it was his last and only chance. It took a long time for Civvy and Med to work their way down from the airship dock. They were helped by the flood of soldiers entering the palace, able to mix with the new men and gradually put some distance between themselves and Predator. By the time the alarm was quelled, the two rebels were within sight of the convocation hall doors. The antechamber was curiously devoid of troops as Civvy and Med entered from the central corridor. They paused to survey the room. Nothing. No courtiers, no soldiers, no palace guards. "When we get out of here, you know what I'm going to do?" Med said as they proceeded. "What?" "I'm going to drink myself into a stupor the likes of which not been seen before." Civvy smiled. "Sounds like a good idea. What's your drink?" "Black eye." This was a dull drink made from fermented lichen. "Never had any," she said. "Why do they call it black eye?" "Oh, it has something to do with the effect. You drink enough, you fall down, wake up the next morning with a black eye." "That's an old man's tale." Civvy and Med whirled. Out of the shadowed alcove in the rear wall came Tainel and Garnon. "Cousin!" Med burst out, but Tainel's somber face stilled any further display of joy by the young doll rebel. "What have you been doing, then, Civvy?" said Tainel coldly. "My duty," she replied. "You attacked the airship, didn't you?" She folded her arms. "Isn't that why we came?" "Did you destroy Predator?" Civvy chewed her lip. "No." "Where's the rest of your group?" "Dead. Where's yours?" Tainel flipped the mantle back from his shoulders. "Lost or slain? I don't know, but now there must be 4 companies guarding the airship. We'll never get to it. All we can do now is find Eldamaria and get out of here." She said nothing. Garnet and Med walked ahead a few paces while Tainel fell in step beside the Vec woman. "You disobeyed my orders," he said in a voice for her ears only. "I had an opportunity and chose to take it. And failed." Their boots clacked loudly on the faux marble. "If Eldamaria is dead, I'll see you die as well." She raised an eyebrow. "I'll make my case to any council or court you can raise." "I'm not talking about a trial," Tainel explained. "I mean just this. If Eldamaria is dead, I'll kill you." Civvy nodded. "You can try." 30 yards outside the prison tower, they ran into their first checkpoint. A mix of palace guards and regular soldiers had blocked off the passage with a wall of spears and shields. Tainel stepped in front of Garnon and Med. Piled against the wall were 3 dead Moggs. Their sword wounds were still oozing blood. "Halt!" said the guardsman in the shield line. "Stand and be recognized." Tainel saluted. "Corporal Excelsior of the 4th Company. This is my squad. We're supposed to patrol out to the prison and back." He rolled his eyes. "Trouble is, nobody told us what we're patrolling for?" "Don't I know it?" said another guard. "The alarm sounds, we turn out, and what happens? Nothing." Civvy pointed to the dead Moggs. "What's that?" "Bunch of Moggs tried to force their way through here?" First guardsman grinned. "They didn't make it." The guards pulled 2 sets of propped-up shields aside and let the rebels pass. "These fellows aren't very smart," Garnon observed. "Don't underestimate them," said Tainel. "There's thousands of troops in the stronghold, so no one can know them all. This little charade of ours can't succeed much longer. As soon as somebody recognizes you two from Predator, figure out there's no Corporal Excelsi, we'll be in the soup." They passed through another roadblock before reaching the bridge to the prison tower. The bridge itself was empty. Tainel had the others follow him single file to hide their numbers from any oncoming foe. They entered the lower doors of the prison without encountering anyone. "This is too easy," Civvy said. "Someone should be on guard here." "Smells bad, I agree. Tainel looked both ways down the curving passage. Wonder where they're keeping Eldamri. Should we split up and search? Asked Med. Not this time. Stick with me. Maybe in for a fight. Tainel chose to go right. They moved slowly down the hall, checking the doors they passed for noises. Except for some soft shuffling and scraping sounds, they heard nothing. Guess prisoners don't last long here, said Civi. The farther they went, the darker the hall became. Flowstone lamps provided anemic orange light. Civi sniffed at them, recalling her failure to ignite predator with such a lamp. Tainel tried to adjust one for more light. Instead of getting brighter, it went out. Let's get out of here, Garnet said suddenly. We can't abandon Eldamri, said Tainel. You're getting spooked, Med suggested. So a light burns out. So what? There's no real danger yet. Let's go on. Tainel and Civi were going on regardless. An open door partly blocked the passage in front of them. Tainel waved for everyone to stop. A low, steady light shone from the open door. With hand signals, he indicated he wanted Garnet and Med to stay in the corridor. He and Civi would investigate the room. Tainel peered around the heavy door. The cell was set up as a torture chamber. Manacles on the wall, pans of hot coals, and all kinds of hideous tools were laid out on a table in the center of the room. A stout chair with its back to the open door. Someone was in the chair. Tainel drew his sword. He slipped in and Civi ghosted in behind him, Totenvec in hand. He carefully circled to the left around the chair while Civi circled right. More and more, the sitter's face came into view. Eldamri! Tainel rushed to the chair. The elf was tied hand and foot to the massive chair. His head hung down. Tainel put a hand to his chest and felt a strong heartbeat. He lives! He announced joyfully. Civi knelt and began cutting the bonds on his legs with the blade of her Totenvec. Tainel used his sword to free Eldamri's hands. Water, Tainel said. Civi brought the clay pitcher from the table. Tainel gently splashed some of the elf's face. Eldamri stirred. You came, he said weakly. I'm sorry, brother. There's been trouble, Tainel said. The airship? I tried to destroy it, O Eldamri, Civi said. I failed. Tainel poured water into the elf's cupped hands. Eldamri drank. Can you stand? Tainel asked. We should get out of here as soon as possible. Give me a moment. Civi leaned her hip on the table. When she did, something cracked under her feet. Flecks of Vulcan pottery. She picked one up. The shard was yellow boneware with a red glaze on it, just like the water pitcher Tainel held. Someone must have broken an identical jug. There were sounds of movement in the hall, the scrape of metal stone. Med cried out. Soldiers coming! Tainel, hurry! In a flash, Civi was at the door. She looked past the two doll fighters and saw at least 15 palace guards coming down the passage. Time to go! Time indeed! Eldamri rose swiftly from the chair without a trace of pain or injury. Tainel, still kneeling beside the chair, stared in amazement. I was beginning to think they'd never get here, the elf said. What are you talking about, brother? Said Tainel. You're doomed, rebel fool. Tainel stood up, sword in hand. He'd spent many days with Eldamri. They'd always been of similar height. Tainel was about a hair taller, in fact. The Eldamri with him now was more than 6 inches taller. Even as he gazed in horror at the familiar face, the bruises and burns were fading from view. By the gods, he said. It can't be! What is it? Civi said. To her horror, she saw Tainel raise his sword to strike Eldamri. The surprisingly strong elf caught Tainel's wrist, and with a brutal motion, he broke the doll fighter's arm. Tainel's sword fell to the floor. Already, the two rebels in the corridor were hotly engaged with Citadel guards. The too narrow hall didn't allow the Rathi troops to exploit their superior numbers, giving the rebels a small chance. The imposter Eldamri, still holding Tainel by the arm, stooped to retrieve the rebel's sword. He examined the hilt briefly, nodded, then with his left hand thrust the blade through Tainel's chest. The doll rebel gasped. Bastard! Civi yelled. She flung the Totenvec at the imposter. He tried to dodge, but he was hampered by the dying Tainel. The iron blade caught him on the side of the neck. He snarled with a rage and hurled Tainel's lifeless body at the Vec warrior woman. Tearing the blade from his neck, the imposter seemed to swell even larger, distorting his false elven features grotesquely. Civi recovered the Totenvec and lunged for the door. Med and Garnin were holding off the guards, who seemed strangely reluctant to press their attack. Civi stood back-to-back with Med, watching the door of the interrogation cell. She expected the misshapen Eldamri to emerge, but instead, Revenil Vec stepped into the hall. She knew it was the same man by the neck wound she'd given him. Dreadlord, called the captain of the guards. Are you all right? Quite all right. Watch out for the pretty one. Her little toy can sting. What's happening back there? Garnin said. desperately parrying concerted sword thrusts. "Never mind! Keep your eyes in front, and fight!" Civi cried. The Greven imposter did not attack either. He backed away, always keeping his eyes on Civi. At the first door beyond the open cell, he stopped and put a key in the Flowbot lock. Greven stepped further back, opening the door as he went. "I'd love to remain and watch the fight, but I have an appointment with Lord Krovax," he said. "In my place, I leave you Gelarak." From the black cell door, a single red tentacle writhed out, seeking something to grab. It found its liberator's leg and tried to coil around it, but Greven brought his heel down sharply on the leathery appendage. It retracted a foot or two and changed direction. 2 more tentacles appeared, followed by a fat, wallowing torso covered in the same dark red leathery hide. "Friends," said Civi, "we're in trouble." The rebels and the guards stopped fighting to gaze at the monster. More and more of the Gelarak oozed out of the door. A bulbous upper appendage reached the light. The top was covered with a mass of white miniature tentacles that wriggled and flexed in faster imitation of the lower tentacles. Midway between the thing's neck and animate hair was what might be a mouth, an obscene star-shaped orifice rimmed with oily gray skin and drooling pink saliva. The palace guards muttered among themselves and fell back. "You have only to keep the rebels from escaping," Greven told his troops. "Otherwise you can leave them to the Gelarak." The beast filled the width of the passage. There was no sign of it fully emerged from its cell. The tentacles gripped the door of the interrogation room, pushing it shut. Lyn Civi wondered if the monster would simply crush them with its disgusting ponderous bulk. As if in answer, the vile mouth erupted outward, inverting the wet skin to reveal row upon row of conical teeth. She lashed at the creature 4 times in quick succession. The blade of her weapon scored deep gashes in the monster's blubbery flesh, but it hardly seemed to notice. A blood-red limb as thick as her arm wrapped around her ankle and jerked her to the floor. The Gelarak, moving with astonishing speed, hurled its toothy lips at her. Med stepped in and drove his sword through the creature's mouth. Blackish blood poured from the wound, and the Gelarak vibrated with pain. It heaved Med off his feet, threw him against the wall. The respite gave Civi time to slash the tentacle gripping her leg. It loosened, and she scrambled out of reach with help from Garnet. The Rathi troops had withdrawn more than 6 yards. Civi got to her feet. "I don't think this monster knows friend from foe. Let's see if it likes fighting them as well as us." They retreated to the point where the guards had stopped. Civi called out, "Oh, Captain, hear me?" "What do you want, rebel?" "That beast has no eyes. I wonder if your men taste as good as mine do." "What's your point?" "Just wondering what happens after we're dead. How you gonna stop it?" More mutterings from the Rathi soldiers, made all the more urgent as the Gelarak rolled rapidly down the passage after them. Civi and comrades ran right at the guards, lowered their sword points. The Gelarak hit the line of guards and caught 2 in its tentacles. They yelled and hacked at the creature with their swords. Some of their comrades joined in. A few at the rear turned and fled. "This is no warrior's fight," Civi said. "Your master cares nothing about your lives." The Rathi captain watched, a loathsome look on his face. One of his men vanished underneath the Gelarak, his screams muffled by flabby flesh. "Fall back!" shouted the captain. "Fall back to the bridge!" The stronghold troops broke and ran. The captain tried to corral the rebels, but Civi warned him off with lightning cracks of her Toten Vec. The Gelarak had slowed its advance while digesting its first catch. Civi, Med, and Garnan backed down the left-hand passage. "You can't escape," the Rathi captain said. "Surrender to me, and I'll protect you from the monster." "You'd better worry about your own hide, oh captain," Civi said. "We'll take our chances elsewhere." He slapped Med on the back and ran down the open passage. Halfway around the tower, they waited and listened. The heavy sliding noise of the Gelarak wasn't evident. "What happened to Tainul?" Garnet asked. In a few words, she described the bizarre trap they'd fallen into. Tainul's death. Garnet covered his face, wept quietly. Med looked to Civi. "When did Greven Elbeck become a shapeshifter?" "Why ask me? Anything seems possible in this mad fortress." Soft scraping sounds filtered down the dim corridor. Time to move on. They arrived at the opposite side of the tower and noticed another gate. It was standing open, so they reconnoitered carefully before going through. There was no sign of Greven or anyone else. Med examined the gate. "Its lock's been forced." "Why would the Rathi force their own lock?" said Garnan. Civi narrowed her eyes. "They wouldn't. Come." They burst on the bridge. 2 Rathi soldiers stood guard halfway along to the next tower. When Civi, Garnan, and Med appeared, the sentries drew swords and blocked the path. "Wait," muttered Civi under her breath. "We're still friendly soldiers until somebody tells them otherwise. They approached slowly. The sentries had the visors down on their helmets. At a distance of 6 paces, one of them shouted, "Halt!" Civi saluted sloppily. "Greetings?" "What's the watchword?" said the sentry. "Eh?" The sentry flung out his arms, pointing his sword at Civi. "What is the watchword?" Civi glanced helplessly at Med and Garnon. They dropped their hands to their sword hilts. "Tell this stupid soldier the watchword," the sentry barked. The second sentry replied, "Tant Jova." "Tant Jova? Who are you?" Civi demanded. Up went the visors. "Coreno! Seamus!" There was much backslapping as the rebels were reunited at last. Civi cut short the celebration. "Tano and the rest are dead, and our presence is known." "We heard the alarm," Seamus said. "We came to find Eladamri, but we didn't." "He's with us," Coreno said. "He got himself out and rescued another prisoner from the cells. They're hiding in the map room yonder." "Take me there," Civi said. "I have much to tell him." The hall filled with dignitaries, court functionaries, and idlers. The array of banners was still in place, but so great was the demand for space, the flags were pushed back to the walls by the steadily growing crowd. Belby stood on the dais beside the empty throne, watching people arrive. Still in her Phyrexian armor, she fixed the Rococo emblem of the Hidden One in the plume holder of her helmet. She'd been unable to find Urtai all morning, and a cold clutch of fear gripped her inside. She could think of nothing else to do but hide the plasma discharger behind the vacant throne. Fresh power stone glowed within it. It was an hour past midday. The incoming crowd thinned. From beyond the open doors came the tramp of men marching in parade step. Onlookers scampered out of the way as a column of men in bright steel armor and white mantles, 4 abreast, marched straight into the convocation hall. It was the corps of sergeants, 200 strong. In accordance with tradition, their scabbards were empty, but Belby knew the 200 toughest men in the army of Rath didn't need swords to intimidate their opposition. The leading sergeants, led by Nasser, halted the column at the foot of the throne. No orders were shouted, but the outer 2 files of men made quarter turns to the right and left, respectively. The assembly shrank from the line of sergeants, who thus formed a glittering lane through the crowd. Nasser bowed to Belby. "Excellency, my Lord Krovax is coming," he said. Belby did not reply. She nudged the Phyrexian weapon with her toe and felt its reassuring weight. A tall figure came walking across the antechamber. Belby's pulse throbbed hard until she recognized the broad shoulders and towering height of Greven Ilvek. He bowed to her from the doorway and tried to find a way outside the human aisle. In the end, he pushed his way through the crowd and took a place at the wall on Belby's right. Someone else approached, a smaller person this time, too small to be Krovax. Belby made out his face at a long distance. It was the core, Fura, garbed in gray leather. He moved with sinuous grace between the stern, unmoving sergeants. He took his place beside Greven and never took his eyes off the young emissary. The timepiece behind Belby silently flickered through some abstruse Phyrexian equation, then displayed Rathi time. 1 hour, 1 minute past midday. She saw him 100 yards away, striding confidently down the central corridor toward the antechamber. He was wearing his white ensemble again, the one Belby would forever associate with the hostage massacre. Her recognition must have shown on her face, for the entire hall felt hushed long before Krovax reached the outer chamber. His footsteps were loud against the hard walls. Belby licked her lips and tried to swallow. When Krovax reached the top of the steps, Nasser raised his right foot and stamped down hard. Steel and stone rang together as he cried, "Lord Krovax! Krovax!" shouted the sergeants. With the skill of an actor, Krovax waited at the door until his men stopped cheering. Then, in utter silence, he ascended the aisle, his gold-trimmed mantle rippling with the wind of his passage. Greven switched his gaze to Krovax, but Belby noticed Fura was still watching her. Krovax halted at the foot of the throne.
Your Excellency sent for me?
She nodded, slowly. Krovax turned and faced the hall. "People of Rath," she began. "I, the emissary of the overlords, the lens of Abkil Dro, the chosen representative of the Hidden One, greet you."
All power to the Hidden One!
Krovax exclaimed. "All power to the Hidden One," answered the crowd. "Since arriving here, it has been my mission to find a new governor of Rath. I was charged by our masters to put the crown on the head of the strongest candidate, to ensure the rule of Rath was given to the most powerful, most intelligent, and most loyal servant of the Hidden One." Belby lowered her hand behind the throne, feeling for the tip of the plasma discharger. She found the smooth prongs, but before she could finish her ritual declaration or pick up the weapon, a small disturbance broke out at the rear of the hall. She stepped away from the throne. A small, bright object about the size of an apple flew into the room. People at the back shrank from it or swiped at it with their hats, and in neither case did anyone touch it. Kovacs was livid. Without moving, he tried to snare the flying object with flowstone pinchers called up from the floor or nearby columns. The spiny sphere easily dodged the clumsy claws, and the only ones caught by them were unfortunate courtiers near the center of the crowd. The object danced down the aisle. The sergeants watched it, but they were unsure whether to break ranks and seize it or not. The ball flew past Kovacs' head and hovered in front of Belby.
"A friend of yours?"
asked Kovacs icily. She held out her hand, charmed by the playful sphere. It ran its soft spikes gently over her palm, and she was seized with a desire to have this object and keep it with her always. It darted away, and Belby ran after it. The crowd dissolved in frantic gossip. Kovacs grabbed Belby's arms as she passed.
"Where do you think you're going?"
"I must have it.
"What about the ceremony?"
I'll come back. I will, as soon as I catch this thing." He shook her, none too gently, saying,
"You can't leave until you discharge your duty. Say the word, you stupid little..."
Grevin interrupted.
"She cannot say anything now, my lord. She's under a magical compulsion."
"What? Who dares..."
He must have answered his own question, and he shut his mouth. Releasing Belby, he spoke in Nasser's ear. Kovacs went to the steps leading up to the throne and sat down, casually crossing his legs. Nasser shouted for quiet. "People of Rath," he said, "there will be a minor delay in the ceremony. Lord Kovacs has asked that no one leave the hall until the emissary returns." To make sure of it, the sergeants locked arms to keep people away from the doors. Belby ran out, chasing the glowing ball. Nasser spoke hastily to the seated Kovacs, then hurried after.